Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carolyn McCollum, and as the co-chair of the ZSR Library Lecture Series, I would like to welcome you all to today's lecture. Our guest speaker is Dr. Paul Escott, Reynolds Professor of History, and the title of his lecture is History and Myth: Why We Misunderstand the Civil War Era. Dr. Escott received his BA from Harvard College and his MA and PhD from Duke University. He taught at UNC Charlotte before joining the history faculty at Wake Forest in 1988. At Wake, he served as the dean of the college from 1995 until 2004. He is a member of Phi Beta Kappa, has received fellowships from the Whitney Young Jr. Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation, and twice won an award for the best nonfiction book published by a resident of North Carolina. He has authored and edited many books and has had numerous articles and chapters published in refereed journals, books, and encyclopedias. Without further ado,
Thank you very much for that nice introduction, and thank you all for being here. I certainly appreciate your interest. I want to say a special word of thanks to several members of my department who have come. I think that their appearance is above and beyond the call of duty. They've heard me on other occasions, and they probably deserve some combat pay for being here today. Throughout my professional career, I've often taught a course on the Civil War and Reconstruction, and I feel that I've really been lucky to do so. You may think that I feel that way because you know that the Civil War attracts a lot of interest, and you would be right to assume that perhaps many students would already have some interest and knowledge about the Civil War. In fact, though, it's usually the opposite. I enjoy teaching the course because my students are generally misinformed. What they've learned from our national culture, what they think is true about the Civil War, is usually incorrect or only partially true or misunderstood. It's a pleasure to teach them in the course because the experience becomes a process of discovery, an intellectually exciting excursion into some new and unfamiliar territory for them. The Civil War is wrapped up and obscured in myths, and the process of penetrating those myths and encountering the realities of an unfamiliar time and place is stimulating and intriguing. I should add another point about teaching the students. It's exciting to work with them because most of them have minds that are open to the new ideas that they're going to encounter about the Civil War. They don't have the disadvantage of having lived for several decades with certain fixed ideas about the Civil War era. They haven't become invested in certain ways of looking at it. Because they're willing to look at the record and read the primary sources, they usually change their minds. That is not true, unfortunately, for many people who are my age or older. Too often the rest of us become committed to inaccurate myths, and we end up being captives of the wider culture. That, by the way, is one of the curses of being a Civil War historian. Very often, if I'm invited to someone's wedding reception, the host will come up to me and say, "Oh, you're a Civil War historian. I want you to meet Uncle Harris or Grandfather Jones because he's a Civil War buff." And I soon find myself listening to a lot of awful and inaccurate ideas about what went on. And all that I can do is smile because it's not my place to be rude at anyone else's wedding reception. Well, there's not time today to explore all the myths or popular misconceptions about the Civil War, but I will try to examine two that were very important and popular. I'll also try to explain why they have such power to overshadow history's facts and replace the facts with fictitious myths that interfere with our ability as citizens to use our history intelligently and fruitfully. In an effort not to give offense to anyone, I'll try to be an equal opportunity offender. I will try to explode one myth that has been precious to Southerners, and a second one that in recent years has become proudly adopted by self-congratulating Northerners. Let me begin with the long popular, indeed long sacred, Southern myth of the lost cause. This lost cause myth has grown and been embellished over many decades, and it has quite a few elements in its complete form. If we tried to list them, we'd start with the idea that the South did not secede to protect slavery. Instead, according to the myth, the South seceded to protect state rights and preserve constitutional liberty. Another aspect of the myth is that all Southerners, whether they were rich or poor, black or white, were united in their holy cause. And according to the myth, the Confederacy's soldiers fought gallantly and chivalrously, and that the South was not defeated. There was no defeat as a result of errors or disunity or other failings. Rather, the South was overwhelmed by numbers. Further, in defeat, the South was supposed to have been loyal, cooperative, and submissive, but a vindictive North supposedly imposed a harsh military rule, grinding Southerners under the Army's heel, disfranchising the white leadership class, and turning the South over to an orgy of misrule by ignorant blacks, a period that was called Black Domination. And finally, the crusade of the Ku Klux Klan was deemed to have been a courageous effort to save white civilization in the South, and it finally brought Reconstruction to an end in 1877. Now, for many decades, all of these items were essential to the lost cause myth. They became social truth in the post-war South, and people dissented from these ideas at their peril. Many of these ideas still have currency with a substantial number of Southerners today. All but one of them, I would argue, are wrong or distorted or grossly misleading. Now let's take them one by one. The seceding states declared to the world boldly and explicitly that they were leaving the Union to protect slavery. South Carolina led the secession movement, and it quickly decried the increasing hostility of the North to the institution of slavery. And South Carolina's secessionists charged that Lincoln's Republican Party had announced that a war must be waged against slavery until it shall cease throughout the United States. So to protect slavery and to protect their interests, South Carolina led the secession movement. Mississippi followed soon after, and it justified its momentous step by explaining, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. And because Mississippi felt that there was a threat to slavery by the forces of abolition, it was going to choose the option of dissolving the Union. To take another example, Georgia denounced the free states for threatening their security and attempting to disturb our domestic peace. The problem was that the North had elected a nominee of the Republican Party, a party that called anti-slavery, and the secessionists in Georgia said that the Republican Party was anti-slavery in its mission and in its purpose. Texas affirmed what it called the undeniable truth that Africans were rightly held, and that in that condition only could their existence in this country be rendered beneficial or tolerable. And they went on to argue that slavery is abundantly authorized and justified by the Almighty Creator. For reasons of time, I won't extend these examples. It is true, of course, that Southern leaders had a long list of additional grievances, from economic issues to Northern attitudes of moral superiority, which they felt denied them equal status and respect. But there is no doubt that the fear of anti-slavery and the determination to protect slavery was the central issue in the secession movement. What about the much heralded unity of the Confederacy? Well, in fact, the Confederacy was often disunited because the Confederate experience proved to be very surprising, unexpected, and unpleasant. Possibility of disunion appeared during the secession movement when 8 slave states did not initially secede, and even after the war began, there were only 4 of those 8 that joined the Confederacy. But then within the Confederacy, the war itself brought great suffering and many unpopular policies. Instead of having a limited central government with states being dominant, Southerners found that the central government of the Confederacy had become very strong and very powerful. Many things did not go well. Poverty and hunger ravaged a large portion of the population and engendered anger, resentment, and despair. The Confederacy proved to be a profoundly unsettled, unexpected, and unpopular experience. The military element of the lost cause myth is closest to being true. It's perhaps a bit exaggerated, but not really terribly erroneous. Southern soldiers did fight well, while Northern armies sometimes fought poorly, especially in the early years of the war. But Confederate generals did make mistakes, and all was not gallantry. At Gettysburg, General James Longstreet 3 times almost desperately warned Lee not to order Pickett's charge. He told him that no 12,500 men ever arrayed for battle could take that position. But Lee insisted, and the results were disastrous. There was a good bit of desertion. In the last year and a half of the war, the North's vital advantage in numbers was partly due to huge desertions from the Confederate armies. Jefferson Davis himself publicly admitted in September 1864 that 2/3 of our men are absent, most of them absent without leave. What about the actions of white Southerners in defeat? They were not submissive and cooperative. They tried to send leading rebels, such as Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, back to Congress to resume their role in the federal government. That was just one example of an uncooperative attitude. Another one which disturbed voters in the North was the passage of black codes in 1865. These restrictive laws were designed to keep the free people of the South, the former slaves, in a position that was very much like slavery. And there were some Southerners who warned their fellow citizens that this was not the right approach. Here in North Carolina, a politician named Victor Barringer warned his fellow citizens, "Our business is to recognize change." He said, "We've been defeated. There's going to have to be change now." But many people in North Carolina felt that there should be little, if any, change in the status of the former slaves. Certainly, the legislature felt they should not serve on juries, should not vote, they should have very few rights. Historians such as Dan Carter and Michael Perman have given abundant documentation of Southern intransigence in 1865 and 1866. A good illustration of the attitude of the South was its vote in 1866 on the proposed 14th Amendment. Northerners felt that some amendment was necessary now that slavery had been abolished, because you'll remember that apportionment in Congress, representation in Congress, was based upon population, and in the days of slavery, the black population was counted as 3/5 of a person. Now slavery had been destroyed, so black people were going to be counted as whole persons. Did that mean that now that the war was over and 625,000 lives had been lost and the South had been defeated, that the rebel states were going to enter the Union with more power in Congress than they'd ever had before? That would be a very surprising and unexpected result of the war. The 14th Amendment did not require that black people would vote, but it provided a mechanism by which representation could be reduced in proportion which the number of adult male citizens would bear to the whole number of citizens in the state. So in effect, the 14th Amendment could give to the former rebel states an incentive to let black people vote, by which they would gain representation in Congress, or there's the possibility of a penalty, by which they would lose representation in Congress. In the entire South, in all of the state legislatures which would need to ratify this amendment, there were only 33 individual legislators who voted for the 14th Amendment. It did best in Alabama, where it was defeated by a vote of 69-8 in the state Senate and 69-8 in the Assembly and 27-2 in the state Senate. Given this intransigence, it's no surprise that white Southerners hated Reconstruction because the North did insist on some changes. But there was no harsh military despotism, no long disfranchisement of Confederate leaders, no black domination or orgy of misrule. What about the military occupation? Well, the United States Army rapidly demobilized from over 1 million troops at the end of the war to 57,000 a year later, and several months after that, fewer than 20,000. Many of the troops that were stationed in the South were in the western areas, in western Texas, where they were fighting Indians. And by 1874, in the entire South outside of Texas, there were only 4,000 United States troops. Well, those were troops in the South. What kind of occupation does that amount to? If we compare the situation in the so-called occupied South to our recent experience in Iraq, we can maybe get some sense of numbers and space. The United States had over 150,000 troops and tens of thousands of contractors in Iraq. And we certainly know that those numbers were not sufficient to pacify the country and to bring everything under control. In the American South after the Civil War, there may have been 5,000 to 6,000 troops. But Iraq was little more than half the size of the Confederate States. So with far more people there, it was impossible to subdue the opposition. And with so few troops in the American South, what this really meant was that there would be detachments of troops in some of the larger cities, but certainly this was not a case where Southerners got up in the morning, left their door, and found troops on the streets. After the South blocked the 14th Amendment, the North passed a law in 1867 that required that black men should be able to vote and hold office. Black Southerners then did participate in politics, and some got elected to office, but never in percentages that came close to equaling their share of the population. There never was black domination. There never was a black majority in any of the state legislatures. Nor was there a level of financial irresponsibility that was notably greater than that of the governments that preceded or followed Reconstruction. My dissertation advisor, Robert Durden, did some pioneering work on this topic. In North Carolina, a great deal of the financial mismanagement had to do with bonds to support railroad building. And Professor Durden illustrated that most of the bonds were issued by the white state government that had preceded black Reconstruction. What about disfranchisement of Confederate leaders? The white leadership class lost its right to vote only briefly from the decision that new governments were going to be formed until they ratified the 14th Amendment. That process began in March of 1867, and for 6 of the 10 remaining Confederate states it ended on July 9, 1868. I should have mentioned that there was one southern state that did ratify the 14th Amendment, Tennessee, and it was promptly readmitted. But for the other 10, this period of a little more than a year was the time in which Confederate leaders were not allowed to vote. 4 of the 10 states resisted until 1870. As for holding office, the 14th Amendment did prohibit office holding by high-ranking Confederate officials. But in 1871, Congress allowed the vast majority of Confederate leaders to hold office once more. White leaders and many other white Southerners hated Reconstruction because they were being forced to make some changes by the national government. But I hope that we have reached the point in our nation's history when we can frankly admit that the Ku Klux Klan was a white terrorist organization employing murder and violence to defeat Republican administrations and return the Democrats to power. We certainly have had terrorism in this country before. There was a great deal of it in the period of Reconstruction. Thus, the lost cause myth was a myth, not a fact. Why was it so powerful for so long? We can understand many of the reasons for it. Certainly we can understand the need to create it. Southern leaders had gone to war proudly, self-confidently, even boastfully, and they had suffered a devastating defeat. The very human need to explain and excuse that defeat was a natural emotion. There was a need to escape censure. Thomas Nelson Page, the Virginia writer, published a book in 1904 in which he frankly said, "In 50 years, the defense of slavery will be deemed the world over to have been as barbarous as we now deem the slave trade to have been. We must prevent the impending disaster." And one way to do that was to give an alternative explanation. We can also understand the reasons why loyalty to the lost cause myth continued for so long. Among those reasons was the fact that in later decades, many Northerners continued to look down on the South and on Southerners, who naturally resented such assumptions of inferiority. Moreover, certain powerful groups in the South in the decades after the war had their own particular reasons to become well organized and to elaborate the lost cause myth. Former generals and officers from Virginia took the lead in developing a cult of Robert E. Lee. Jubal Early was one of those who was first into this effort and who worked hard at it. And many other generals formed something called the Southern Historical Society, which praised Lee and argued that he had been without fault and never made mistakes. Instead, his army was defeated by numbers. Southern women needed to support their defeated husbands and their wounded sons. And they worked very energetically in the years right after the war to give a decent burial to dead soldiers and to erect monuments in their honor. Before long, politicians became involved in very important ways. They made a religion of the lost cause, bending every effort to compel white voters to support the Confederate cause, white supremacy, and the Democratic Party, which they argued should all be considered together. The Democratic Party would be the party of the fathers, the logical successor to Confederate beliefs. After the Populist Party in the 1890s threatened the supremacy of the Democrats used fraud and violence to regain control of state governments and to disfranchise African Americans. Thereafter, in a one-party system with very low levels of voter turnout, the Democrats used racism and lost cause myth to solidify and reinforce their power. In that repressive, undemocratic political and social setting, the United Daughters of the Confederacy became very influential. Its leaders were usually well-placed women in high positions in society. They asserted their power as custodians of pro-Confederate cultural values. They made it their mission to transmit belief in the lost cause to future generations and to control thought. A leader of the Texas division of the United Daughters of the Confederacy explained very candidly what needed to be done. Her words were, "Strict censorship is the thing that will bring the honest truth." And the UDC did a great deal to censor opinion and to reward pro-Confederate patriotism. They engineered the firing of professors, even those who dissented just modestly from the lost cause myth. And they even went so far as to examine all kinds of textbooks. I was surprised to find that in one case, they read hundreds of pages into a high school math book and demanded the expunging of a word problem which involved U.S. Grant winning a battle. And they succeeded. The text was changed. Well, finally, we should remember, too, that for many decades, the South was economically and culturally rather isolated from the rest of the nation. Change occurred slowly in the society that William Faulkner described. With these forces shaping the culture of the South, it is not surprising that the lost cause myth endured and even gained strength during many decades. But the South was not alone in its myths. Let's turn to the North. Robert Penn Warren years ago realized that the North also engaged in its mythology. He said that the North relied on the Civil War as a treasury of virtue, something that could be trotted out whenever some failing was alleged to describe the North. In recent years, the North's habit of self-congratulation has taken the form of describing Abraham Lincoln as a champion of equality, a great egalitarian. According to this myth, which has become widely and popularly accepted in recent decades and supported by some historians who should know better, Lincoln was a champion of racial equality, a reformer who was wise, humane, and virtually without fault. He has been called a moral visionary, a fervent idealist, a leader who was intent on readying the public for black suffrage, and one who promoted equality. Authors have lavished extravagant praise on his smallest actions and explained away any shortcomings. Previous to the last 10 or so years, it was common if some attitude of Lincoln's that didn't square with our current attitudes was found, people would stress that Lincoln grew in office and that his attitudes were always evolving. Lately, arguments have gone beyond that. There's now a new argument that the man that we used to call Honest Abe was actually tricky. He was simply shielding his purpose of equality while he secretly pursued that agenda. According to these arguments, Lincoln used some very crafty methods in the pursuit of equality, for he was an artist in the Machiavellian uses of power. As you probably sense, this version of Lincoln conflates his role in ending slavery with the role of Martin Luther King Jr. Lincoln, like King, supposedly championed equal rights for black citizens who, 100 years after Appomattox, were still suffering harsh discrimination, and whose mistreatment in the North, though it might have been de facto instead of legal, was almost as oppressive as in the South. In such a myth, Lincoln becomes a protagonist in the glorious story of America's virtuous role in promoting human freedom. The history of mid-19th century America and the realities facing Lincoln or any other political leader of that era were very different. The facts are more informative, more revealing, but less inspiring, and they furnish less reason for self-congratulation as a society. If we examine them briefly, we find that Lincoln certainly was opposed to slavery. He felt that it sullied our Republican robe, that it was in conflict with our national values, but he also felt that he was restrained by constitutionalism. And he also was constrained by Northern public opinion. Lincoln had a persistent interest in the idea of colonization, of providing places for freed black people to live outside the United States. And he was more of a conciliator than a crusader in his dealing with Southern whites. We can see as well that he expected only modest change right away in the status of former slaves. And he expected that progress might be slow. Now, there is no doubt that he believed that slavery was wrong and immoral. He condemned it on many occasions. But he believed that the social, political, and constitutional realities precluded him from fighting for equal status for African Americans in his day and time. Lincoln felt that the Constitution placed a duty upon him as president to respect slave property. This was the position of his party as well. In both 1856 and 1860, the Republican Party placed as a central element in its platform that it would respect the existence of slavery in the states. The Republicans were opposed to extending slavery into new territories. Lincoln supported a proposed 13th Amendment to the Constitution that you probably haven't heard about. As the secession crisis was taking place, the Congress proposed to the states a 13th Amendment, not that would have done away with slavery, but that would have protected it against federal interference forever. And in his inaugural address, Lincoln made clear that he would support that amendment. He understood that it had been passed, and he said that he considered this to be implied constitutional law. Oh, I'm sorry. Here's what I want to do. It was already essentially a part of the Constitution that slavery had a right to exist in the southern states. And he would not object to a guarantee of its existence being made expressed and irrevocable. He felt that he had no lawful right to interfere with slavery in the states. After the war got underway, very quickly, some segments of Northern opinion began to feel that it was necessary to attack slavery if the North was going to win the war and was going to prevail against the rebellion. Lincoln moved more slowly than this kind of opinion. He repeatedly proposed schemes of gradual emancipation, and his most elaborate proposal, which he sent to Congress in December of 1862, proposed that slavery could last until 1900. This kind of emancipation, in addition to being gradual, would be voluntary on the part of the states. There would be federal financial aid to compensate the states for the loss of slaves, and it would be coupled with colonization of African Americans, both slaves and free blacks, somewhere outside the United States. Lincoln's priority was to preserve the Union. That, he felt, was his prime duty, and of course was what most Northerners wanted, whereas many in the North opposed any action against slavery. The Democratic Party of that day was viciously racist and repeatedly attacked Lincoln for exercising too much power, for trampling on the Constitution, and for being an abolitionist. The slogan of the Democratic Party was, "The Union as it was, bring the Southern states back without change, and the Constitution as it is, without any encroachments by federal executive authority." Emancipation was a war measure, which Lincoln took on his authority as commander-in-chief in order to save the Union. Lincoln and other Republicans and many commentators realized that the operation of this Emancipation Proclamation might be limited to the actual period of the war. Perhaps a war measure was not going to survive the war. In addition, the Emancipation Proclamation did not address slavery everywhere that it existed. There were still 4 states in the Union that were not rebelling and that had slaves. So something further would have to be done. We can also note that for many months, Lincoln apparently held the mistaken belief that a lot of the Southern rebels were actually Unionists, that they would love to come back to the Union if they had a chance. Even in the later stages of the war, he hoped to elicit the cooperation of defeated Confederates in rebuilding the Union. And for these reasons, he repeatedly and consistently tried to conciliate the White South, advocating measures that were far more lenient and advantageous to them than the majority of his party supported. Now, Lincoln did urge Congress to support the 13th Amendment in 1864, and this, I believe, was his strongest stand against slavery. But until the day of his death, he was arguing that the defeated Southern states should be allowed to vote on the 13th Amendment. This was another measure of conciliation. It is hard to imagine that the amendment could have obtained the requisite 3/4 of the states and been ratified unless the South was required to give its approval. But while he was alive, Lincoln never spoke of demanding that support. What did Lincoln expect the status of the former slaves to be? We could find many instances to illuminate this, but one that's particularly revealing, I think, has to do with the letter that he wrote to General John McClernand. McClernand is standing on Lincoln's left here. The detective Alan Pinkerton is on his right. McClernand was an Illinois politician, a Democrat, not a Republican, but someone Lincoln had known for many years. And after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, McClernand wrote to Lincoln and deplored the proclamation and said that he knew many Southerners who wanted to come back to the Union still. Lincoln wrote to him on January 8, 1863, and he pointed out that the slave states that were not included in the proclamation, that was Tennessee and 4 of the northern border states, can have their rights in the Union as of old. That is, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't apply to them. Their slaves were not threatened. Even the people of the states included, he said, need not be hurt by it. 2 things could help them. One was federal aid, but the other was programs of apprenticeship for the colored people. And if they followed those ideas, they may be nearly as well off in this respect as if the present trouble had not occurred. Well, certainly freed slaves would be happy to be freed, but they would hope for greater progress than that. Lincoln also put forward, while the war was underway, a program for Reconstruction called his Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction, and it became known as the 10% Plan. Some of its features are revealing about what he expected to be the position of the former slaves. He wanted the southern states that would re-enter the Union under this plan to recognize the freedom of the former slaves and provide for their education. But he offered this possibility of temporary arrangements, which he sometimes described as apprenticeship, as a means to encourage the southern states to follow the program. It is hoped, he said, that the already deeply afflicted people in those states, that is, the white people of the South, would be somewhat more ready to give up the cause of their affliction, slavery, if to this extent this vital matter is left to themselves. Not until 3 days before his death did Lincoln publicly express his personal preference that some black men should be allowed to vote. The very intelligent, he said, and those who had served in the U.S. Army. What does all this mean? Well, for one thing, Abraham Lincoln was a practical and ambitious politician of his time, not of ours. He worked in a deeply racist country. His policies evolved in an anti-slavery direction, which I am sure pleased him, but more slowly than the ideas of many Republicans, newspaper editors, or commentators. Harper's Weekly, the most popular magazine in the North, had declared as early as September 1862 that the prejudice against the colored race is one that we must overcome. On another occasion, it criticized Lincoln's ideas of colonization by noting that the hostility of black Americans to colonization bears a remarkable resemblance to a sentiment called by poets patriotism. They wanted to stay in this country. The views of abolitionists and radical Republicans championed equality. Lincoln's policies did not, though they were anti-slavery. I could give more examples if time allowed, but perhaps I can answer questions later. Let me briefly address the question of why this myth of Lincoln the egalitarian has taken hold. At other times, Lincoln's image was very different. From around 1900 to 1940 or even 1950, Lincoln was usually praised for being a man who wanted to preserve the Union, not for being someone who wanted to champion black equality. But clearly one of the great influences was the civil rights movement. As American policy changed, as Americans' moral sense grew, people felt that slavery certainly was wrong and that discrimination was wrong, and it would be important to update the image of one of our great leaders to fit this treasury of virtue more closely. Moreover, I would say that in general, we Americans prefer to celebrate our history rather than to study or analyze it. It's very deeply ingrained in our popular culture that we praise the United States as an exceptional nation. Our heroes have to live up to that idea and live up to that role. The roots of this image of America are very deep. They began with the Puritans' aspiration to build a city on a hill. They grew, I think, with the arrival of every wave of immigrants who were hopeful of a better future in a new land. They've been nourished by the rhetoric of thousands of politicians. To cite just one example, let me mention Woodrow Wilson, who said that Columbus's discovery of the Western Hemisphere had given humankind an opportunity to set up a new civilization. The United States, according to Wilson, would be a new human experiment, a new start in civilization. Life from the old centers of living, surely, but cleansed of defilement. The Founding Fathers, Wilson said, brought liberty to mankind on consecrated soil and established a new government that would be a beacon of encouragement to all the nations of the world. We hear similar words again and again in our modern politics. The United States, we are told, is the greatest nation in the world, not just today, but throughout history. There certainly is much to celebrate in the history of the United States, but it is also true that we are not at all hard-headed or analytical about our history. We do not assume that our historical leaders were fallible human beings who made mistakes like human beings elsewhere. We do not acknowledge that our nation has been mistaken. For the United States, we like to claim remarkable achievements and ignore shortcomings. The idea that the highest patriotism consists in pointing out the nation's errors is not very popular now. At least publicly, we tend to claim that everything was admirable and exemplary. I think obviously, too, the power, affluence, and worldwide influence of the United States today affects our attitudes. We are still near a high point in the American imperium, and our leaders are always emphasizing greatness rather than failures. All of these factors feed into a culture of myth. We can understand this phenomenon, it's common in human history, but I leave you with this closing thought. A realistic way of looking at our history is, I believe, a more productive way of using our history. It's the job of historians to engage in realistic and accurate analysis of our nation's past. And it's the job of all of us, as responsible citizens, to think realistically about our history so that we can recognize our problems as well as our virtues, so that we can improve our society, and so that our powerful nation, which has a great impact on the world, can act in ways that are informed, mature, and responsible. Thank you very much for your attention. I guess we have a little bit of time for questions, and if any of you have questions, I would be happy to answer them. Yeah, Billy.
Paul, this is quick. It's a linguistic question. My grandmother raised me in the 1940s and said that if you were from the South, you had to call this the war between the states. And if you were from the North, we had to call it the Civil War.
She didn't say the War of Northern Aggression?
No. And this was in Cincinnati, so we're right on the river, somewhere on the border. And that's how I grew up. So is that a myth, or is that true, or is it ridiculous?
Well, some of the Southern leaders that I referred to were determined that this war would not be known as a civil war, that it should be known as the War of Northern Aggression or something along those lines. I've run into that in my lifetimes. I've encountered people who didn't want to call it a civil war. The North Carolina Division of Archives and History ran into trouble some years ago when it was, I think, posting a website about the Civil War, and some people objected to it being called a civil war. They were able to point out, though, that Robert E. Lee used the term Civil War, and that perhaps gave him a little bit of protection. But there are still people who object to any of that terminology. It obviously serves important political and social and ideological purposes. Yes, sir.
I read in the newspaper here in Winston-Salem recently about the Confederate monument downtown, and they're like trying to figure out what to do with it. I guess they're selling the land that it's on, and some people want to do away with it, and other people want to preserve it. I think they quoted a lady from the Confederates, Daughters of the American Confederacy. But when I look back on those monuments to the Confederacy, and I consider them, or compare them to, like, this was Germany, and it was a monument to a Nazi soldier. Do you think that comparison is fair? That you can look at Confederate monuments now, soldiers, and it would be the same thing as like commemorating and honoring Nazism in Germany?
Put me on the spot, huh? I hadn't heard about the controversy downtown because I've let my subscription to the local newspaper lapse. But increasingly, these issues arise about monuments, and I confess to having mixed feeling about it. In part because I was fortunate enough to spend the spring semester last term in Spain, and Spain is undergoing a big controversy about some of the monuments to Franco's dictatorship. As you may know, he created an enormous basilica called Valley of the Fallen. And I had visited it a couple of years before, and then I visited it again last year. The socialist government that was then in office had imposed some new rules, arguing that this should never be a place where any political demonstrations occurred. It should simply be a religious site, because there was a church there, a Catholic church. And under the cover of that argument, and also because they said that there was danger from falling rock, they had created a new pathway into the basilica. And what this meant was that you could no longer walk out away from the whole complex and have a vista of the fascist architecture that it was. I had divided feelings because on the one hand I wasn't sympathetic with Franco's dictatorship or with what he had done, but on the other hand I thought it was kind of important for our students to be able to see this fascist architecture and learn about it and know what it represented. And the action of the government really was keeping anyone from seeing that. So I certainly wouldn't want to see governmental approval given to horrific things that had happened in the past, but I also think that there's some need to remember our history, not to eradicate it, including being aware of what happened that was not inspiring to us today. So I'll leave my answer at that if you'll let me. I'm not sure what I would do with the Confederate monument downtown. Is it one of those soldier monuments? There are, of course, thousands of those throughout the South. And it probably would be impossible to remove them all. I'll bet that would never come around. Yes?
Using your idea of an analytic approach to our own history, even the history here at Wake Forest, do you believe that Wake Forest alums Cash and Dixon played a role in promulgating the lost cause myth? And if so, is there anything about the curriculum that they had here, students at Wake Forest, within the history department or other parts of their education here at Wake Forest, that might have contributed to that?
Are you a plant giving me an opportunity to brag on my department? Because the history department has done wonderful things here. We had a symposium several years ago that Michelle Gillespie led on Dixon. He was a horrible racist who was very influential around the turn of the century, and one of his books was the inspiration of that film, which portrayed a terribly racist interpretation of Reconstruction. Cash, I think, though he wasn't of an entirely modern sensibility today, did a lot that was useful in terms of revising people's thinking about the South. He was more of a critic of the South, someone who loved it but hated a lot of things about it. So I wouldn't be as harsh on him as on Dixon, but certainly Wake Forest has had some graduates who contributed a lot of negative things to American culture, just as we had others who contributed many good things. And probably we should remember in that vein that President Poteet, who worked hard against anti-Darwin laws, was also a eugenicist who favored eugenics programs and who probably had some influence in that being created in North Carolina, which led to a program that is in the news today as they're trying to decide what to do about the victims of these eugenics programs who were sterilized. Yes?
Can you respond? A Southerner is frequently challenged by someone from other parts of the country. Why are you Southerners always talking about the Civil War? I'm from Connecticut. Nobody talks about it. Or Colorado, or whatever. What is it about the Civil War that makes you so, why do you talk about it? And one answer that I've heard is, well, we're defeated. Anybody who's been defeated has more sensitivities than the victors do. But is there a better answer to that question?
In addition to the pain of defeat, there certainly were these groups that tried to keep the consciousness of the war very strong in order to benefit their party or their ideological purposes. I think you could tell people from the North with justice that one of the reasons that Southerners hung on to these ideas so long is that a lot of Northerners kept looking down on them and assuming they were superior to them. And I know it's been true that there were periods after the Civil Rights Movement got underway when Southern communities, in some instances, were doing a much better job of integrating their schools than Northern communities were. I began my teaching career in Charlotte, and when I first taught, I saw that there was a lot of defensiveness about the South and its history among my students. Then, a few years later, the problems in Boston with their public schools began. And some of you may know that Charlotte sent a delegation of people to Boston to try to advise the Southies there on how they could integrate more effectively. And there was a change in the attitude in Charlotte. People began to feel better about themselves because they could teach something to the snotty Northerners. And that has been an issue, I think, in keeping it alive. It's true, too, that in comparison to the South, a lot of other things happened in the North's history. I mean, soon after the Civil War, huge amount of immigration occurred in the North and rapid industrialization. The whole society changed. And before very long, there were many, many people in the North who had no reason to care about the Civil War. It wasn't a part of their past or their ancestors' past, and it didn't have much relevance to their present. So the North, in some ways, was able to move beyond the Civil War, whereas because of economic and political situations in the South, Southerners remained mired in that history more than those of the North. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have a feel for the current status of organizations like the UDC? Are they fading because their cause is fading as well? Or what's your sense of what's going on there now?
I'm reluctant to feel too confident about this, but I do believe that most of these organizations, the UDC, another group that's appeared called the League of the South, the Ku Klux Klan, that these groups have increasingly become marginalized. The UDC still claims to have a sizable membership, but there's not much evidence that they're being very active or having much impact. Years ago, I was once asked to give a talk to a UDC group, and I went and told them about all the conflict in the South, but I didn't offend anyone because most of the ladies fell asleep. The average age was probably 75 or 80. They found my talk very restful. But I'm hopeful that these groups are becoming more marginalized. There's certainly, were periods not too long ago, in the 1960s or even the early 70s, when the Ku Klux Klan was more dangerous, but it became more marginalized. This group called the League of the South had a vogue and was gaining support for a while until some of its leaders began to say obviously racist things, and then a lot of respectable people turned away from it. It is true that the Sons of Confederate Veterans have become more outspoken in their pro-Confederate attitudes lately. But I don't think that the most powerful elements of Southern society are very interested now in holding on to those ideas. It doesn't seem to be something that will serve their interest or advance the interests of the region, and therefore I hope that these things are going to be left more in the past. Oh, one more
I have a question. In the South, they had the slaves. What percentage of the people in the South actually owned slaves? Obviously, the plantation owners had tons of slaves, but most people were not plantation owners, and I didn't know they had slaves, or was it just a small minority of the people that had most of the slaves?
Your question's a good one, and although the percentages vary from state to state, from 1830 to 1860, the percentage of slaveholding families in the South dropped from about 33% to 25%. Most white Southerners did not own slaves. The large majority of those who did own slaves had a small number of slaves. But the economy and the culture, the society was wrapped up in the idea of a slave system. And Southerners had come to believe that their equality among white people depended upon the subordination of black people. It's a strange idea to us when we hear it in 2012. But many Southerners really believe that all societies, Jefferson Davis and John C. Calhoun said, had always been divided on the basis of wealth. It was the rich versus the poor. But they argued here in the slaveholding South, all white men are equal because we don't draw the line on the basis of wealth, it's race. And Alexander Stephens said as soon as the Confederacy was formed that this was the only society in the history of the world that had gotten it right, and that Thomas Jefferson had been so wrong to talk about all men being created equal. He said the crucial question of the Civil War, and one that we have struggled with and didn't solve in the war, was the status of the Negro in our form of civilization. And Southerners believed that slaveholding was essential to their whole social system. And the elite could warn the poor that if there was a change, it's the poor who would suffer. It would be the ordinary white Southerner who would suffer from the change, that the wealthy would be able to insulate themselves from the problem. I hope that begins to be an answer to your question. Well, perhaps we're done, and we're about on time too, so I appreciate your coming. Thank you very much.